Mayor John Tecklenburg, Gary White, Mike Seekings, Maurice Washington, Sheri Irwin, and Renee Orth are all running to become Charleston's next mayor. I sit down one-on-one with one of the candidates, Renee Orth, for a special edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and download my free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. Renee Orth, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you so much for having me, Quintin.
You're very welcome. Obviously, you are a lawyer at trade, and now you are a current Charleston City mayoral candidate.
Yes, I am.
And I know you're from the great state of California.
Mm-hmm.
What got you from being an attorney at trade to now saying, hey, I'm going to lead the city of Charleston?
Well, I moved here about 4 years ago because my partner got a job offer at MUSC that was too good for him to pass up, and he wasn't going to leave California without me. So here we are. And I waited, kind of waited around for a while, like getting to know the city. I did take the bar exam here, so I'm licensed in South Carolina. But my passion is really food and food justice, because I think that that's the kind of foundation for any kind of vital community. That if we're not eating the right food and eating together and preparing food together the way humans have done for thousands of years, then anything we build on top of that isn't going to work. And you can see what is being fed to a lot of our school kids here who come from economically disadvantaged families. That they're not being nourished the way they should, in my opinion. And so I founded a nonprofit called the Stone Soup Collective. We make soup from mostly local produce, a lot of it donated from local farmers. And I, with a bunch of my fellow collectivist volunteers, turn that into soup that mostly goes to low-income elders in need, because I found out in talking to people in the community that was the demographic that was least well served. And so I've been doing that for about 2.5 years. And so it's much, lawyering is, the only thing I do for money, but as much as I can, I do community organizing, and really that's where my heart is. And so seeing the mayoral position and my frustration, I do like John Tecklenburg as a human being. I think he's a lovely person. I think that our city right now needs visionary leadership. That we're talking about, the symptoms of climate crisis. We're talking about flooding. We're talking about storms, but we're not talking much at all about climate crisis.
And I'm going to get to that in just a minute.
Okay.
Let me get back to food insecurity. You said this on your website, quote, we have a lot of food insecurity and issues of food quality in our community that we can actually solve ourselves using the resources we have at our disposal. What issues do Charleston have with food quality right now?
Well, particularly, I can tell you that I was volunteering at the Pink House over the summer. They have a free summer camp there, and I was doing stone soup with the kids and got to see firsthand the food that they were being fed through the school system for the free breakfast and lunch program, which I'm grateful that exists. I'm grateful these children are being fed, but they, I think I counted about 42 grams of sugar in the breakfast, Fruit Loops and Pop-Tarts, hot dogs and Doritos, that this is not food that I would ever feed a child. Just me. I don't think that it's, actually I grew up eating Fruit Loops and hot dogs, so just to kind of remove the judgment from anybody who on occasion feeds their children these highly processed foods that, and several of the children were already suffering from, obesity at that young age. And so just thinking about what this food is doing to their bodies and to their minds, their ability to learn. And, Charleston, we're not a poor city. We don't have limited resources in that regard. And we also have everywhere. We have sun, we have land, we have fresh water. Those are the ingredients you need to grow food. And I'm particularly, and this is kind of a little bit of a tangential thing, but concerned about food independence. I think if you start noticing where your food is coming from, the food that you buy at the grocery store, you'll notice that a lot of it comes from very long distances. And as climate crisis continues to get worse, as I believe it will, that the fragility of our food system is something that we need as a community to think about. And becoming food independent, growing as much of our own food here locally has many benefits, but in particular, it will give us some buffer against disruptions to our food system, which if you look historically, many societies have crumbled when the food, because of famine, because of the drought, the food source. There's a Spanish proverb I recently read, which is there are only seven meals between civilization and anarchy. And so really making sure that we are thinking in the long term and preparing our community while we are not under extreme stress to endure whatever comes our way, whether it be massive hurricanes, whether it be a terrorist attack or an outbreak of an illness. There are basically an infinite variety of ways that the food coming into our community could be slowed or stopped. And I think it's irresponsible of us to not take action now to ensure that we aren't going to have civil breakdown, breakdown of civilization here in Charleston.
And what other resources would you use for us to end food insecurity in Charleston?
Excuse me. I am a big fan of supporting local farmers. A lot of the produce that we do buy, because we do buy some for our soup, comes locally. We are a customer of Grow Food Carolina, which is a local food hub.
Right.
I love what they're doing. I think it's really, really important. And so being able to, and I'm working on this now, trying to get more of our local institutions to buy from local farmers. I'm working on a project right now with some other kind of food justice people to create systems that can really support our local farmers, because we do have a lot of arable land here that is not being used, and that regenerative agricultural practices, which really means tending the soil in a way that big agribusiness does not, and even a lot of our small farmers don't necessarily, has been identified by scientists as a very powerful leverage point for sequestering carbon. But about a third of the greenhouse gases that are in our atmosphere right now have been released through our unwise agricultural practices, which means that if we can reverse that, and the great thing is you can do that in a fairly short amount of time, and it's not a sacrifice for anybody. It actually leads to more nutrient-dense food. It holds more water. So for us in the Low Country dealing with flooding, the more we can nourish our soil and grow trees and bushes and all the plants that can suck up the water and hold it, that we can actually move the needle on multiple fronts. That we can feed our elders and our young people higher quality food. We can buffer our community against disruptions to our food system. We can create edible rain gardens, so actually dealing with the consequences of climate crisis. And I think it would make our city even more beautiful than it already is.
Now, how many of those rain gardens do you want to have here in Charleston?
Now, I personally think that every ornamental lawn, and I'm not in favor of demanding or coercion to me is the weakest form of power, but through education and inspiration, that once people see that these rain gardens are actually beautiful, that they bring the pollinators, the butterflies and the bees and all our flora and fauna here, provides an ecosystem for them, that people will want to do this.
Now, you talked earlier about John Tecklenburg as mayor of the city of Charleston, and you talk about creating a visionary leadership. What is your vision for leadership in Charleston?
I am a firm believer in the power of people. So my website for this campaign is wethepeopleformayor.com.
Right.
And I believe that government, for good intentions, has taken on a lot of the responsibilities that we used to take on as citizens, for caring for each other, for making sure our environment's being protected. And that as we have given over our power, given over our responsibility, we've given over our power to the point where we feel like our main obligation as citizens is to elect better leaders and hold them accountable. I want to switch that around a little bit and use the government to support a bottom-up transformation in Charleston. So, for example, we have a housing shortage here, and we can talk about how we're going to deal with big developments and fill and build, which I think are very important topics. Or we could provide financing for people to build auxiliary dwelling units in their backyards above their garages. That this is a way that you can create more density in neighborhoods without fundamentally transforming or disrupting the character of the neighborhood. And it's actually putting the power in the hands of the people to solve this problem of housing shortages. So that's just an example of what I would like to see done.
Now, if you were to be elected mayor, what would you want people to hold you accountable for?
I think walking the talk. I threw my hat into the mayor's ring primarily because of a lack of recognition at our city leadership level of climate crisis. And so, basically making my tenure as mayor about making Charleston as carbon responsible as we can possibly get through community activation, through empowering and helping finding funding for people to plant edible rain gardens, for example, or to build the auxiliary dwelling units. That there are things that we can do, excuse me, that use the resources that we already have available to solve our problems. And I'm not a big believer in big, expensive infrastructure projects, especially at this time in Charleston's unfolding. I think that we need to preserve our scarce resources for dealing with the coming difficulties that are undoubtedly going to come to Charleston because of climate crisis. And how bad and how soon it's going to happen, nobody knows. But we do know that it's coming, and if we're already seeing the signs of it. And so doing things like investing, expecting the 526 extension would probably end up costing, $1 billion. Like that's not a wise choice to make for investing $1 billion when your city is facing an existential crisis.
What other choices do you have when it comes to 526?
I am a big proponent of carpooling as a solution to lack of public transit and traffic. That if you look around you when you're driving, that most of the vehicles on the road are being used at 20% capacity, even when they're being used, because they're designed to carry 4 or 5 passengers, and usually it's only the driver. And there's technology that we can use. Waze has a carpool app now that has recently gone live here, right. And we have this infrastructure, right? The smartphones that we didn't have in the 20th century. We have this in the 21st century, that we can leverage this, what is really an expensive piece of infrastructure. We're all individually paying for it, but you add all that up, it's a very expensive asset that we share. And so being able to use this technology to help us better use the resources that we already have. There's the scientists who study traffic. And being from Los Angeles, I can tell you we have been trying to build our way out of traffic for my entire lifetime, and it hasn't made a difference because of what's called induced demand. So the more you build roads, the more development, the lower the traffic, then people start driving more because they can get where they need to go. So there are all these complex ways that people adapt to their traffic situation. And so I expect what will happen if the 526 is built, that Johns Island will basically be completely suburbanified. It'll look like Mount Pleasant. And I don't think that people of Johns Island, that most of them want that. I think it's deeply unwise, particularly given that the Dutch have just told us that we need to protect Johns Island as a buffer against hurricanes.
You talk about being from LA and how they're trying to build themselves out of traffic. Mm-hmm. How do you build yourself out of traffic here in Charleston if you're mayor? I
don't think you do. I think we need to use the technology that we have to encourage people to rideshare, like actual rideshare. Uber and Lyft call themselves rideshare apps. They're not actually, you're not sharing anything unless you're, riding with a friend. And so looking at how successful those companies have been at basically leveraging the asset that we have in our vehicles as the public, leveraging the infrastructure we have in our smartphones, that Uber and Lyft have been able to put those two things together and actually provide a far more affordable way for those of us who have the extra, $10, $15, $20 to pay for a Lyft or an Uber. And so, what I'm envisioning, and I think what Waze enables us to do, which is exciting because that's a relatively new opportunity for us, is to use the Uber and Lyft model, but actually instead of paying the $10, you're paying $2. You're paying basically the gas money. So it's kind of a new version of, you fly, I'll buy. If you ever did that when you were younger, you'll drive it and I'll buy the gas. And so, I've shared this idea with many people, and really the response I get generally depends a lot on the situation the person is in. I have an acquaintance who works downtown who spends about $50 a day lifting or Ubering to work. She doesn't make that much money. When I shared with this idea with her, she was like, absolutely, we need to get this going. And the thing about a carpool app is it requires critical mass of people to make it work. Because I have only discovered the Waze carpool app being live in Charleston. It's been live in California for a while, a couple of weeks ago, and I have posted rides on there and posted requests for rides. Right now, it's not being used by a whole lot of people, and so what I envision the city's role in that is to encourage local businesses, especially the big institutions like MUSC, to incentivize their employees and their students to use this as a means of getting around. That we can shrink our carbon footprint, we can avoid the expenses of big infrastructure projects that we can't really afford. I mean, technically, right now, yes, we have some space for taking out more loans, but the second that things get ugly, that can change very quickly. And so, just making sure that the choices we're making and the investments we're making are made from the perspective of our long-term survivability as a city.
What is the current budget for the city of Charleston right now?
I think it's $220 million, ballpark of $220 million.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What would you take into that budget and what would you take out?
I don't have a specific line-by-line proposal for that. Let me think off the top of my head if I can come up with any general statements about that. I'm not sure.
When you talk about, earlier we talked about fill and bill.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to be mayor, what would your stormwater manual look like and how would you proceed with that?
I think it will focus on the piece of the Dutch dialogues about rainproofing our city.
Okay.
So they basically told us that we need to rethink about our attitude towards water, that we're not boxing the water, we're actually doing jujitsu with the water. So jujitsu is I believe the translation is the art of yielding.
Oh, okay.
So understanding that by protecting and enhancing our natural water systems, we can cooperate with nature rather than try to dominate nature. If you think about, for example, why the western edge of the peninsula is sinking, because it was filled, right? I think those engineers, back when they originally started doing that, thought they had solved a big problem for us, and they had temporarily, but now it's sinking and it's causing a huge problem for us. And so I think it's important that we understand that the big, what's called great infrastructure projects, so pouring concrete, the big drainage project that's happening under Spring Street right now, that those kinds of answers are a lot of times Band-Aids rather than actually treating the root cause of the disease, and also can make matters worse. So for example, New Orleans, which obviously is dealing with a lot of huge issues, the Army Corps of Engineers installed some, I don't know if they were levees, I'm not sure what the specific word for it, but the lower end of the Mississippi River to try to prevent flooding. And what that has actually done is led to masses of land lost on the coast of Louisiana, because where the soil used to spread and create a delta, it is basically going straight into the Gulf. And leading to less land on the coast of Louisiana. So it's just an example of how when you think you're going to use engineering and concrete to solve a problem, that ultimately you're going to have to pay the consequences, because there is going to be there's going to be a price to be paid for that. And so things like having a seawall around the peninsula, that if you read the literature on seawalls, it's not, generally speaking, a very economically viable way to deal with rising sea levels. And also you get the effect of wherever the seawall ends, that part of the land or the peninsula gets far more of the brunt of the force of the sea. So I'm not saying that there aren't some of these projects that we will need to put into place in order to make particularly the peninsula viable. But that we need to be circumspect and recognize that as much as we can work with natural systems, definitely preserving our wetlands, putting an end to filling wetlands and building them. I'm 100% in favor of that, and I'm a little disconcerted that it's taken so long for that to come to the city.
Now, how many low-lying areas and wetlands are there with development?
I've said that we have about 100,000 structures at or below or in flood-prone areas in Charleston. So I'm not sure how many of those are homes versus commercial.
And now, when it comes to obviously the low battery idea, you talk about the brunt. How much of the brunt will high battery receive with this new low battery project?
You'll have to ask an engineer that question. That's outside of my knowledge base.
And you talked earlier about the Spring Fish Burn project.
Mm-hmm.
How much money should they be able to spend for that right now?
Well, I mean, it's hard to know because it depends on how well the structure or the project actually works. I can tell you, I had the opportunity to go down into the tunnel about a month ago, and the people I was talking to on the job, granted they weren't the engineers, they were the people who were building it, which is an incredible just feat of human ingenuity and ability. But they had reservations about how effective it was going to be for more than two inches of rain, and so making sure that I think it's now about $200 million that we're investing in that project. Making sure that we understand that there's a risk of it not working the way we expect it to, and also what are the alternatives? You can build a whole lot of rain gardens for $200 million that would have knock-on benefits for decades. And the truth is, we can't eat the concrete, right? And so many of these great infrastructure projects are I forgot. They told me the number. I asked how many cubic yards of concrete that they measure. It was an astronomical number. And concrete is a very intense source of greenhouse gas emissions. And so just in terms of thinking about the big picture, the idea that we are going to solve a symptom of climate crisis by doing something that's actually contributing to the crisis in the first place is a little unwise, I would say.
Now, let's say, for instance, hypothetically, if you were to take away the Spring Fish Burn project and put it into rain gardens, how many rain gardens would you put around that area?
Well, and the thing about water is it can flow a long way. And the interesting thing about rain gardens is they're actually far more effective when they are built on higher ground, because there's more opportunity for the water to go deeply into the water table before it backs up, right? Before it kind of hits its maximum level. But if you start noticing all of the ornamental lawns and concrete, so impervious surfaces where we don't need impervious surfaces, that's another big thing about rainproofing a city is eliminating as much as feasible the impervious surfaces. You will see that there are opportunities for kind of slowing down, spreading, absorbing water all over the city.
All over the city. Mm-hmm. You talked earlier about the auxiliary,
dwelling units.
Units. How much would that cost the city of Charleston and the average taxpayer?
Well, I'm not saying that we should, as a city, pay for those units. I'm saying that we can help homeowners get funding for them, recognizing that they are helping us alleviate our drastic housing shortage in a manner that doesn't require high rises. It doesn't require filling in wetlands. That to be responsible, we need to figure out how to pack more people into a smaller space, but ideally without damaging the character of the city and the neighborhoods. And I think auxiliary dwelling units are a good way to do that.
And where would you get your funding from?
I think there are probably plenty of programs at the federal and state level, and also finding ways to work with the private sector. So I know for a lot of public housing or affordable housing, a big part of what the government can do is kind of guarantee a certain amount of the loan repayment so that the risk is lower, so that the interest rates are lower, so that it creates a incentive for people to build these houses. But in the end, if everything goes as planned, it doesn't actually cost the city anything. It's more like we're the guarantor of these loans. And so looking for opportunities to get the private sector to loan individual homeowners money to build the nanny flat in the backyard or build over the garage in ways that don't actually take money from our budget for other things.
Why loans versus grants?
Well, because ultimately those auxiliary dwelling units are going to be income producing property for the homeowner. And so there's no reason the government should have to give away that money. In trying to to incentivize people to do it by having maybe slightly below market interest rates, for example, so that basically to adjust the levers of incentives so that our citizens are rewarded for doing something that is really vitally important for the city in general.
Is city government too big in your mind?
I don't think it's necessarily too big. I think that the more I personally am in favor of smaller government across the board. I think for example, I heard the other day Maurice Washington was talking about how the church that he attends owns some rental property on the east side, and so they anytime there's a citation for a violation of, for example, and this is the one that he mentioned, people not bringing their trash cans in on time. And to me, that is an indication that as a society that we've taken a wrong turn. That we have the government basically being taking the place of community engagement and communication with our neighbors. Who have we become that we would rather pick up the phone and make a complaint to a city official than reach out to our neighbor and say, hey, it'd be great if you can pull in your trash can, or even take it in for them. If their life is so busy right now that they can't do it, it's that we have kind of lost our way in terms of taking responsibility as citizens for ensuring that our neighbors are cared for, ensuring that our city is vibrant and just. And every time, like I said earlier, every time we're looking to the city to do these things rather than us doing them as citizens, we're growing the government. There's going to be more laws. There's going to be more people enforcing those laws. Personally, I would like to see us as citizens take on more of that responsibility. Understand that being a good neighbor, being a good citizen, being an active citizen is an essential part of what it is to be a citizen of Charleston.
We're sitting right next door to Charleston City Hall. Mm-hmm. Do you understand the process of city government?
I've watched a fair number of the streaming videos.
Have you been to any of those city council?
Briefly, yes,
okay.
But I haven't sat through an entire one. I appreciate the opportunity to watch them from the comfort of my own home. Excuse me. But and I think that is the role for somebody with the vision to understand that because we are a city with such different, I guess all cities have different interests, right? We have Daniel Island, West Ashley, the Peninsula, James Island. All these areas are faced with different challenges, and the role of a leader to not just negotiate a compromise that everybody can live with, but to actually help people understand the fact that we are in this together, particularly with climate crisis and rising sea levels, that we need to respond to this situation the way our parents or our grandparents, or maybe some great-grandparents, dealt with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That level of urgency and existential threat, I think that is what we're facing here, but it's happening in slow motion. And so it's easy when things, kind of incrementally change, like the boiled frog, if you're familiar with I don't know if this is actually true, but it's an interesting metaphor that if you toss a frog into boiling water, it will immediately jump out and save itself. But if you put it in, room temperature water and slowly boil it, it will just sit there until it's a boiled frog. So this idea that when we're faced with an immediate, urgent emergency, like the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we can see, we need to do something. But we're, with climate change, it's a little bit more like a slow rising in sea levels, a slow, increase in hurricane frequency and strength. And so it lulls us into a false sense of normalcy, when really, when you look at what the predictions are for climate change, and generally speaking, they're fairly conservative predictions because scientists tend to be conservative, that what our city is facing is an existential threat. And so looking for leadership who can express the urgency of this to citizens of Daniel Island who, are less vulnerable to flooding than a lot of other places in Charleston, and that we need to work as a team and recognize that if our city is going to not just survive this but thrive in the face of it, it's going to be an all hands on deck exercise.
And I know I got a couple of minutes left on the camera. I thought I'd charge it up a little bit more. But let me talk to you about mobility. You said this on your website, quote, mobility is obviously a huge issue with people across Charleston, be it the working poor who are challenged to get the jobs, businesses who are struggling to find workers who can get to work affordably and efficiently. How many businesses in Charleston are struggling to find workers right now?
I don't have a specific number on that, but I am very well aware that it's a real struggle, particularly downtown, because the housing prices down here have been increasing for quite some time now. And so the people who work down here, I know the Hominy Grill, for example, I think that was the main reason for them shuttering, but that the people who work down here in our food and beverage and in our service jobs can't afford to live downtown anymore. And so they're having to come from outside, which means that our businesses have to pay enough to make it worth their while to get down here and to park if they brought their own cars. And so that dynamic of rising housing costs in the downtown area, forcing our service workers out of town is a huge problem, not just for the businesses, but obviously for the workers as well. And so, not to repeat myself too much, but I do believe the carpooling app is a way that our food and beverage and our service workers can find other people in a similar situation and ideally use the resources that we already have to deal with mobility. Because the truth is, Charleston, because of the population density and the way it's sprawled, that there's not really a feasible way to build a public transportation system here the way New York does or San Francisco does. That will be financially viable. That we're just too spread out and we're too thinly spread to make that make any sense.
You talk about those rising housing costs. What are the costs right now in the city of Charleston?
I think it's really just a matter of supply and demand. Mostly, we have people moving here from all over the country every day, and that increases the demand for housing, and that's kind of basic economics 101. And so, I hear a lot of people, I was having a conversation with a woman the other day who was like, so if you get elected mayor, you're going to stop all this crazy building. And I said, well, let's have a conversation about that. And it turns out that her daughter just graduated from the College of Charleston, couldn't afford any rents downtown. And so ended up having to move back in with her mom in Somerville. And I said, so these two questions or these two issues are very intertwined. To stop development will be to basically put an end to housing, at least temporarily, increasing in the housing units, which means that prices are going to continue to rise, which means a lot of our communities in Charleston, people who are from here, will be pushed out of the city, which has been happening now for a couple of decades. And once those people leave, that community is gone. That a city, a community is the people. And so understanding that these dynamics, these aren't things that we can undo in the future. Once the community is gone, it's gone forever.
If you go over to Charleston's east side right now, which a lot of people say have been gentrified, what do you say?
It's definitely in the process of being gentrified. And gentrification is one of those incredibly difficult issues to address because, of course, at some level, you want to make neighborhoods more inviting, more beautiful, safer. And every time you do that, you increase the property values and you attract people from other places to come live there. And so what that dynamic does is push the people who are from that neighborhood out of the neighborhood. I wish that 30 or 40 years ago, when this whole process kind of started to happen, we'd had the forethought to buy up some of those properties and put them in a land trust so that we could, as a community, ensure that there was affordable housing in those neighborhoods.
What is your forethought about the African American community in the city of Charleston?
I'm always a little reluctant to speak to this issue because as a white woman who's not from here, I know that I have a limited ability to really comprehend the suffering and the racism that has existed here and continues to exist here. I can tell you, when I first moved here, I was quite dismayed and shocked by the segregation here. that I haven't experienced in other places that I've lived. I've lived in New York and San Francisco and Panama, down in Central America for a while. And so seeing that dynamic and over the almost 4 years that I've lived here, understanding the deep distrust that the people of color in this city have for white people. I'm speaking obviously with a very broad brush. This doesn't apply to everybody. And being able to, as I've learned more about the history of this place and the not too distant history of this place either, it makes me appreciate why that is and how vitally important it is to earn that trust. And how do we do that? It's not a short-term fix. It's a long-term, investing in communities of color and doing everything we can to ensure that the percentage of people of color in the city has been declining precipitously over the last several decades, and doing what we can to stop that, because those aren't just statistics. Those are people who are losing their communities.
And we'll be able to talk more about that in depth when we have the mayoral forum next week at St. John's High School auditorium. Let me get to you about the last question. Businesses in the city of Charleston. What are the top 3 big businesses in the city of Charleston in your mind?
Well, obviously MUSC is the biggest employer, and it's the institution that brought me to Charleston, because that's where my partner works. I mean, if we're talking greater Charleston area, obviously, Boeing and Volvo, these big companies that we've attracted to our region to provide jobs. I mean, if we want to talk about tourism, just as an industry by itself, obviously an incredibly important and essential piece of the economic system of Charleston.
What good has John Tecklenburg done as mayor of Charleston in your mind?
Well, I think he has been fighting a good fight for the things that he said in his last election. I wasn't here for the last mayoral election, but I understand from a not so nice leaflet I got in the mail the other day that he promised to fix flooding, fix traffic, and to do put a moratorium on hotels. And so to understand that the efforts he's put into those, and I think the Dutch Dialogues is a great first step in terms of addressing flooding, and that we do have a hotel moratorium now, that better late than never. And you're dealing with forces in our economic system that are powerful forces, and so understanding that it takes time to put the brakes on these things.
What are those powerful economic forces in your mind?
Profits. I could talk for a long time about economics and monetary policy and the dynamics that are kind of almost invisible in our economic system that basically create a demand for more money. I like to think in terms of prosperity, community prosperity, that money, there's a philosopher that once said that confusing money for real wealth is like going to a restaurant and eating the menu instead of the food. And I think a lot of us have been eating menus for a very long time. And so understanding, for example, when you build a hotel that displaces residents, that yes, that's going to bring the financial money, the capital in the conventional sense to our city, but at what cost in terms of our community prosperity, the connections, the community, the sense of place and sense of shared destiny, that those aren't, you can't put those things in a spreadsheet and come out with the right answer. And so really having the perspective to see that that the economic system, in my opinion, is off the rails. That it's fueling this movement toward basically a global extinction. And it's easy to think, when you're reading the headlines across the world, reading about the Amazon burning down and the boreal forest burning, that this is out of our hands. But to recognize that we are taking steps here in Charleston that are actually adding to those forces, that we are doing that to ourselves, and that, for example, there's a development that's happening on James Island around the corner from where I live, where the developer was given permission to cut down a grand oak, and it's a stand of, I think, about 100 pine trees. And we had a tree, I think it was a study, I forgot what it was called exactly, here in Charleston last year, that basically said we need to protect as many trees as we can, including pine trees, which right now don't have protection in the city ordinances. But basically the developer was cutting down this small stand of trees so that they could provide 2 parking spaces per unit of the condos they were building rather than the 1.5 that's mandated by the city. So just looking at that as a microcosm of the macrocosm, that we are cutting down the trees that can help mitigate flooding, that sequester carbon, and we are cutting them down to make room for more parking. And so looking at these small choices that we're making and how cumulatively they're doing the damage that we're, on the other hand, trying to address.
Renee Orth, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you, Quintin. I appreciate the opportunity.
I'll see you next week.
All right.
Yeah, all right. Thank you.